During the darkest years of the Great Depression, families across America faced empty cupboards and heavy hearts. Yet somehow, they found ways to turn scraps into meals and keep hope alive at the table. Today, I'm paying tribute to their courage and creativity by sharing 20 humble recipes that fed a generation and kept their spirits strong. Number 1. Hoover Stew. If you were a kid in the 1930s, chances are you knew the sound of Hoover stew bubbling on the stove, that gentle, wet plop of macaroni softening in a pot of thin tomato broth.
The Depression era, it's around the 1930s, to make Hoover stew.
The occasional sizzle when a rogue splash hit the burner, and the rhythmic clink of a wooden spoon against the side. For families scraping by on next to nothing, this dish was a godsend, cheap, filling, and, if you closed your eyes, just hearty enough to trick you into thinking you were eating something fancier. Named, with a good dose of gallows humor, after President Herbert Hoover, who many Americans blamed for the hard times, Hoover stew was the sort of meal that filled empty bellies without emptying the wallet. It was the potluck hero of Hoovervilles, the shanty towns that popped up on the outskirts of cities, where out-of-work men, women, and children gathered to survive the storm together. The ingredients were as humble as they come. A box of elbow macaroni, boiled until just tender, a can or two of stewed tomatoes, their syrupy sweetness providing the base. Slices of hot dog, bologna, or whatever processed meat was on sale that week, chopped into coins and folded in for a touch of protein. Sometimes corn or beans would make a cameo, whatever happened to be in the pantry, or in many cases, whatever the neighbor could spare. Making Hoover stew was more ritual than recipe. You'd start by bringing a big pot of water to a boil salted, if you had salt to spare. In went the macaroni, swirling like little golden rafts in a choppy sea. While they cooked, you'd chop the franks, maybe just one or two if times were lean, into stubby little rounds. In a separate pan, you'd warm the stewed tomatoes, mashing them slightly with a fork, adding a pinch of pepper or chili powder if you were lucky enough to have a well-stocked spice tin. Once the noodles were soft but not mushy, you'd drain them and toss them right back into the pot. In went the tomatoes, the meat, the can of corn if you had it, and maybe a glug of the salty pasta water to loosen it all up. Give it a good stir, let it simmer until the flavors married, and just like that, dinner was served. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even pretty, really. A jumble of pale pasta, bright red sauce, and rubbery bits of hot dog. But oh, it was beloved. Kids would gather at the table, spoons in hand, eager for their share. Parents would take comfort in the knowledge that their children were, at least for one more night, going to bed with full stomachs. And here's the beautiful thing. When you make Hoover stew today, you're not just cooking pasta and tomatoes. You're stirring up history. You're honoring the ingenuity of a generation that found a way to turn scraps into sustenance and make mealtime a moment of connection rather than despair. So go ahead, boil that macaroni, crack open that can of tomatoes, slice up those hot dogs. When you sit down to your steaming bowl, take a moment to listen for the echoes of the past, the laughter, the scraping chairs, the quiet triumph of making something out of almost nothing. Number 2, Depression-era bread. No yeast bread. There's something deeply comforting about the smell of bread baking, especially when it's the kind you almost can't believe you pulled off with what's in your cupboard. During the Great Depression, yeast was a luxury, hard to find, harder to afford, but that didn't stop home bakers from coaxing up loaves of golden, crusty bread that fed their families and lifted their spirits.
A Depression-era peanut butter bread. This bread does not contain any eggs or yeast.
Enter the no-yeast bread, sometimes called emergency bread, or depression loaf, a humble creation that rose not from fermentation, but from sheer determination. The roots of this bread stretch back even further, tied to soda breads of Ireland and bannocks of Scotland, sturdy, rustic loaves that made do with baking powder or soda instead of precious yeast. In Depression-era America, folks took that same spirit and ran with it, mixing together the most basic of pantry staples to make something that felt, if only for an evening, like abundance. Picture the kitchen on baking day, a small wood stove warming the room, a chipped mixing bowl on the counter, and the rhythmic thump of a wooden spoon against the sides. The ingredients were simple, but worked like magic when brought together. Flour, baking powder or soda, a pinch of salt, maybe a little sugar if you were feeling fancy. Milk was often sour or turned, but that only added to the flavor, and a spoonful of lard or shortening gave the crumb a tender richness. To make it, you'd first sift the flour with the salt and leavening, a step that felt almost ceremonial, watching the soft powder fall like fresh snow into the bowl. In went the liquid, a little at a time, mixed with a steady hand. The dough was rough and sticky, not the silky, elastic mass of a yeast bread, but it came together with a kind of stubborn charm. Shaping was simple, a rough mound patted into shape, sometimes scored with a cross on top. An old tradition meant to let the fairies out, or maybe just to help it bake evenly. Into the oven it went, the smell slowly filling the house, drawing children from their chores and husbands from the fields, noses lifted in hopeful anticipation. The result? A loaf with a crackling crust, an airy but hearty crumb, and a flavor that tasted like home. It was a bread for slicing thick and slathering with lard or jam, for dunking into soups and stews, for toasting over the fire the next morning. Leftovers, if there were any, became breadcrumbs for meatloaf or pudding, not a speck wasted. Making this bread today is like shaking hands with history. It reminds us that resourcefulness is its own kind of wealth, and that the best meals often come from the simplest means. As you stir, knead, and bake, you're not just following a recipe. You're reenacting a ritual of survival, pride, and quiet joy. So the next time your cupboard looks bare, remember the Depression cooks who stared into the same emptiness and saw not defeat, but possibility. Pull out the flour, light the oven, and bake yourself a little bit of hope. Number 3, potato pancakes, tater cakes. If there was one thing the Great Depression taught families, it was how to give leftovers a second life. And few dishes embody that spirit better than potato pancakes, or as many affectionately called them,
simple side dish today. We're making old-fashioned potato cakes.
Tater cakes. Born from cold, leftover mashed potatoes, these crisp-edged golden beauties were a triumph of thrift, transforming yesterday's scraps into today's comfort. Picture a small kitchen, maybe a coal stove rattling in the corner, a mother rolling up her sleeves as she pulls a battered bowl of mashed potatoes from the icebox, or more likely, the cool windowsill. The potatoes are cold and stiff, flecked with a little butter, or maybe a dab of lard from the night before. Into the bowl go a handful of flour, an egg if you're lucky, a bit of chopped onion for bite, and a sprinkle of salt and pepper. If the family chicken had been generous, maybe even a splash of milk made its way in. Mixing it all together was part art, part instinct. The goal was a soft, shapeable batter, not too loose, not too dry. With practiced hands, the cook would pat the mixture into small patties, flattening them gently, feeling the way the potatoes yielded under her fingers. Now comes the part that lingers in memory, the sizzle. As those cakes hit a hot, greased skillet, the kitchen would come alive with the crackle of frying. The aroma was irresistible, earthy, rich, with a hint of sweet caramelizing onion, and soon, children would be drifting in from outside, noses twitching, eyes wide with anticipation. Cooking was quick, just a few minutes per side, until each cake was a deep golden brown with a crisp, lacy crust and a tender, fluffy middle. They were stacked high on a plate, maybe wrapped in a clean dish towel to keep warm, and served as a meal unto themselves, or as a hearty side to whatever soup or stew was on hand that night. Potato pancakes weren't fancy, but they were beloved, and they carried with them a kind of quiet ingenuity. They told a story of nothing wasted, of making do and making delicious, of feeding a family when there was little in the larder, and they connected generations. The recipe had deep roots, drawing inspiration from Eastern European immigrants who brought their beloved latkes across the ocean, blending them with Appalachian and Southern frugality to make something uniquely American. Today, when you fry up a batch of tater cakes, you're joining a long line of cooks who knew the true meaning of stretching a meal. You might jazz yours up with scallions, herbs, or cheese, but the heart of the recipe stays the same, a celebration of simplicity and survival. So, the next time you find yourself with a bowl of leftover mash, don't toss it. Reach for a little flour, heat up the skillet, and listen for that first happy sizzle. You're about to make a dish that's more than just food, it's history on a plate. Number 4, cornmeal mush. Few sounds mark the early morning of Depression-era kitchens, quite like the slow, steady stir of a wooden spoon in a pot of cornmeal mush. It was a rhythm heard across farmhouses, tenements, and shanty towns alike, a kind of edible heartbeat that promised, if nothing else, a warm belly to start the day.
We're going to be making cornmeal mush. Now, for this recipe, you're going to just need 3 ingredients.
Cornmeal mush was the workhorse of hard times, simple, cheap, and endlessly adaptable. With just cornmeal, water, and a pinch of salt, families could craft a filling porridge that stuck to the ribs and stretched well into the next meal. In the South, it had deep roots in Appalachian and Native American traditions. In the Midwest, It was a breakfast staple, and across the country, it became a lifeline during the leanest years of the 1930s. The scene is easy to picture. A mother in her faded apron, standing over a small stove, carefully trickling cornmeal into boiling salted water, stirring constantly to keep it from lumping. Steam curls up from the pot, filling the kitchen with a warm, nutty aroma as the mixture thickens, turning from a pale, watery swirl into something hearty and spoon-worthy. For breakfast, mush was served hot, often plain, sometimes sweetened with a little sugar or molasses if the pantry allowed. When milk was scarce, families thinned it with water or used evaporated milk, drizzling just a splash over each bowl. Children, bundled in hand-me-down coats against the morning chill, would gather at the table, cradling steaming bowls in their hands, spooning up bites that warmed them from the inside out. But the genius of cornmeal mush didn't stop at breakfast. Leftovers were poured into a pan or mold to set and cool, firming into a dense slab. The next day, it was sliced and fried in bacon grease or lard until the edges turned crisp and golden, the soft middle giving way under the crunch. Served alongside eggs, beans, or greens, fried mush was a beloved supper, a kind of twice-cooked marvel that proved you didn't need much to make a meal stretch. The beauty of mush lies in its humility. It doesn't pretend to be anything it's not. It carries no airs of luxury, no fancy flourishes. But what it does offer is comfort, economy, and an almost meditative simplicity. A reminder that sometimes the most satisfying meals are the ones built from the humblest ingredients. Cooking it today is like reaching back through time, stirring the same pot stirred by countless hands before. As you whisk the cornmeal into boiling water, feel the texture change beneath your spoon, watch the pale gold deepen, and listen to the soft plop as it thickens. Serve it hot with butter and syrup, or chill it overnight to fry up in slabs the next morning. Either way, you're tasting a bit of history, the quiet, sturdy resilience of a generation who made a lot out of very little. So, go ahead and make a pot of cornmeal mush. Let the aroma fill your kitchen. Let the warmth fill your belly. And let the memory of those who came before fill your heart. Number 5. Cabbage soup. In the cold kitchens of the 1930s, when the winter winds rattled the window panes and the larder shelves sat bare, one humble vegetable came to the rescue again and again: the cabbage. Cheap, sturdy, and surprisingly filling.
I'm going to make a cabbage soup. What's so great about cabbage soup is it's very versatile.
Cabbage was a Depression-era hero, and no dish showed off its quiet magic better than a simple pot of cabbage soup. Cabbage soup was the meal that greeted miners home from long shifts, farmers from frozen fields, and children back from schoolhouse walks through the snow. It wasn't flashy, no lavish spices, no fine cuts of meat, but it had the power to fill the house with a savory perfume that promised warmth and nourishment at the end of the day. The backbone of this soup was, of course, the cabbage, green, crinkled, and sweet once it hit the heat. You'd slice it thin, sometimes with a knobby carrot or a handful of potatoes if they were on hand. In went an onion, chopped fine, sizzling in a spoonful of bacon grease or lard, or if times were especially tight, just softened in water. A pot of water or thin broth followed, the cabbage tumbling in like green ribbons, softening and sweetening as it simmered. If a scrap of salt pork or a ham bone could be spared, in it went, perfuming the broth with its smoky, savory soul. But even without meat, cabbage soup had a way of creating its own rich character. The vegetables mingling in a slow, gentle dance until they became something more than the sum of their parts. A little salt, maybe a crack of pepper, and if a miracle arrived, a splash of vinegar or a pinch of caraway, the pot transformed from mere sustenance to something that felt like a quiet celebration. The scene around the table was much the same in farmhouse after farmhouse, tenement after tenement. Ladle after ladle of steaming soup poured into chipped bowls, a loaf of no-yeast bread passed around in rough slices, and the rhythmic sound of spoons scraping up every last drop. For a few moments, as the wind howled outside and the world beyond the door fell away, there was warmth, togetherness, and the simple joy of a shared meal. Making cabbage soup today can feel like a small act of defiance against the waste and excess of modern times. It's a lesson in patience and appreciation, watching the cabbage melt into silk, the broth turn from pale to golden, the humble become extraordinary. It's a chance to stand at the same stove where a grandmother once stood, humming under her breath, ladling out bowls with tired but grateful hands. So slice your cabbage, chop your onion, and let the pot simmer low and slow. Let the aroma drift through your home, stirring up the echoes of resilience, thrift, and care. And when you sit down to that steaming bowl, take a moment to taste not just the soup, but the memory of all those who sat before you, drawing comfort from the simplest of gifts. Number 6, mock apple pie. Now, if there's one dish that captures the sheer audacity of Depression-era ingenuity, it's mock apple pie, a dessert that winked at scarcity and said, "We'll have pie anyway." Picture this. You're standing in a 1930s kitchen, and apples, those sweet, crisp darlings of fall, are nowhere to be found. Maybe the orchard froze, or the family budget couldn't stretch to buy a single one. But dessert was still a cherished ritual, a little punctuation mark of sweetness on the hardship of the day. And so, resourceful cooks turned to the pantry and discovered that with a sleeve of crackers, a handful of sugar, a splash of lemon juice, and a good dose of imagination, they could serve up a pie that tasted so convincingly like apple. It fooled even the sharpest tongue at the table. Mock apple pie's fame spread far and wide, thanks in part to Ritz Crackers, which printed the recipe right on their box in later years. But the spirit of the pie predates the packaging. It's rooted in the Depression kitchen, where necessity mothered invention and home cooks refused to let scarcity rob them of small joys. The process began with the crust, usually homemade from flour, lard, and a little water, rolled thin and fitted into a waiting pie plate. The filling was where the real magic happened. You'd crush plain crackers, saltines or Ritz were the usual suspects, breaking them into rough chunks, not crumbs. Into a saucepan went sugar, water, a generous splash of lemon juice, and a sprinkle of cinnamon. Brought to a boil, the syrup thickened and took on the warm scent of spiced fruit. The crackers were folded in, absorbing just enough of the liquid to turn tender, but not mushy, like thin slices of baked apple. Once poured into the crust, the mixture was crowned with another layer of dough, perhaps latticed, perhaps a simple top crust pinched at the edges, and brushed with a bit of milk or egg if available, for a golden finish. As the pie baked, the kitchen filled with a fragrance so convincing that even the most skeptical family member would wander in, nose twitching, lured by the promise of something sweet. The first bite was always a surprise. The tender, sweet apples, the flaky crust, the whisper of cinnamon and citrus. Sure, if you knew, you might catch the faint cracker undertone, but by then, you were too busy marveling at the sheer cleverness of it all. Mock apple pie wasn't just dessert, it was defiance, a refusal to let hard times erase joy from the table. It was proof that a little creativity, a little determination, and a lot of heart could turn the ordinary into the extraordinary. Today, when you make mock apple pie, you're not just baking, you're stepping into the shoes of the Depression cook, embracing a legacy of resilience and whimsy. As you roll out the crust, stir the syrup, and crush the crackers, you're honoring the memory of those who baked, not just to fill the stomach, but to lift the spirit. So preheat that oven, roll up your sleeves, and marvel at the pie that taught America how to turn nothing into something delicious. Number 7, milk noodles. If you ask old-timers what comfort tasted like during the Depression, many will close their eyes and sigh, milk noodles. It's a dish so plain, so quiet in its simplicity that you'd be forgiven today for overlooking it. But back then, when the cupboards echoed and the family needed something soft, warm, and filling, milk noodles were a small mercy on the dinner table. Milk noodles were the epitome of frugality. A handful of homemade egg noodles, a bit of milk, a sprinkle of salt or sugar, and just enough patience to turn it all into something that wrapped around the soul like a warm blanket. The beauty of this dish lay in its softness, its gentle flavors, and the way it could soothe even the most anxious stomach after a day of worry. In the kitchens of the 1930s, making egg noodles from scratch wasn't a special occasion. It was just how things were done. A cup or two of flour, an egg, a pinch of salt, maybe a splash of water, or milk if needed. Women would gather the dough into a soft ball, knead it until smooth, then roll it out thin on a floured table, the surface dusted like fresh snow. With practiced hands, they'd slice it into ribbons, wide or narrow, depending on the family tradition, and leave them to dry just long enough to firm up. When supper time came, the noodles were dropped into simmering milk, sometimes fresh, sometimes watered down, sometimes evaporated and stretched with water. A little butter or lard added richness when available. For some families, sugar transformed it into a sweet treat. For others, a pinch of salt made it a savory side. Either way, the noodles plumped and softened, the milk thickened slightly, and the scent that drifted through the kitchen was one of quiet reassurance. Children would crowd around the table, bowls in hand, eager for their share. There was no chewing required, just spoonful after spoonful of tender noodles and warm, creamy broth. It was often served when someone was under the weather, when teeth were missing, or when the day had been particularly hard on the family's spirits. In those moments, milk noodles weren't just food, they were balm. The recipe itself, if you can even call it that, was passed down like a family heirloom, often without measurements or instructions. It was a dish made by feel, by eye, by memory, a living link between generations who all knew what it meant to make something out of next to nothing. Today, recreating milk noodles can feel like an act of quiet devotion. As you roll and cut the dough, as you stir the pot and watch the noodles dance in the milk, you step into a long line of home cooks who knew that sometimes the simplest meals carried the most meaning. And when you sit down with your bowl, you'll taste more than just flour and milk. You'll taste the tenderness of a past that refused to be forgotten. So make yourself a pot of milk noodles. Taste the softness, the nostalgia, the resilience, and savor the reminder that even in the hardest times, comfort could still be coaxed from the humblest pantry. Number 8. Vinegar pie. Of all the Depression-era dishes, few are as surprising or as defiant as vinegar pie. It's a dessert that sounds like a dare and tastes like a triumph, proof that even when the pantry was nearly bare, a determined cook could conjure up something sweet to end a hard day. Back in the 1930s, lemons were a rare luxury, as were fresh fruits of any kind, but folks still craved that bright, tangy note in their desserts, something to cut through the monotony of starches and stews, to remind them of sunshine on a bleak day. Enter vinegar pie, a clever creation that used pantry vinegar in place of citrus, whisked into a custardy filling that baked up golden, jiggly, and sweetly tart. The process began with the crust, usually made from scratch with flour, a bit of lard or shortening, and cold water. It was rolled thin on a flour-dusted table, carefully lifted into a pie tin, and pricked with a fork to keep it from puffing. For many families, the crust was the most precious part, a little act of craftsmanship, passed down from mother to daughter, fingers pinching the edges into scallops or braids with pride. The filling was simplicity itself: sugar, flour, eggs, butter, and water, stirred together with a few spoonfuls of cider or white vinegar. Sometimes there was a grating of nutmeg or a pinch of cinnamon, if the spice tin still held a trace. The vinegar worked its quiet magic, adding brightness and depth, transforming the plain custard into something almost lemony, almost fancy, and entirely more than the sum of its parts. As the pie baked, the kitchen filled with a fragrance that was both sweet and savory, buttery and sharp. Children would crowd near the oven, noses pressed to the warm glass, watching the filling set and tremble, the crust darken to a perfect golden brown. It was a small moment of wonder, a hint of celebration in a world that didn't offer many. When the pie was cooled and sliced, the first bite was always met with a little pause, the tongue surprised by the zing of vinegar, the mind delighting in how well it mimicked lemon. The texture was smooth and silky, the sweetness balanced by just enough tang to keep it from being cloying. Served on chipped plates, maybe with a dab of cream if the cow had been generous, vinegar pie became a humble symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Today, making vinegar pie is like baking a love letter to the past. As you whisk the filling, roll the dough, and watch the pie rise and set, you're honoring the generations who refused to let hard times steal every sweetness from life. You're tasting not just dessert, but the quiet determination that turned scarcity into opportunity. So preheat the oven, pull out your mixing bowl, and trust in the alchemy of vinegar and sugar. Let the scent of baking pie fill your home. Let the first forkful surprise you, and let the memory of those Depression kitchens remind you that sometimes a little creativity can turn even the sourest moments into something worth savoring. Number 9. Rice and raisins. In the long stretch of lean years during the Great Depression, few dishes brought as much quiet comfort to the table as a bowl of rice and raisins. It was simple, sure, just 2 modest ingredients, maybe a little sugar or milk if luck was on your side. But in kitchens across America, it was a sweet, warm reminder that even in the hardest times, families could still gather around something that felt like a treat. Picture a farmhouse or city flat in the 1930s, the windows rattling against a cold wind outside. In the kitchen, a pot of rice simmers on the stove, the grains plumping and softening in gently bubbling water. A handful of raisins, often measured by a frugal hand, never by the fistful, is sprinkled in, their wrinkled skins slowly swelling and turning glossy as they soak up the heat. The air fills with a soft, bready perfume, lightly sweet, hinting at something special, something just for tonight. For many families, this was the dessert they could afford, a stand-in for puddings or cakes they could only dream about. The rice was humble and filling, a pantry staple that stretched far. The raisins, though, the raisins were the crown jewels. A scoop from a paper sack, maybe left over from holiday baking or carefully rationed through the winter, they turned a pot of plain starch into something that glimmered with small luxury. To make it, cooks would simmer the rice slowly, sometimes with water, sometimes with a little milk if they could spare it. Sugar was often added, but not always. Many a family grew used to the natural sweetness of the raisins alone. A pinch of salt was the secret handshake of the old-timers, a tiny contrast that made the sweetness sing just a little louder. If there was a bit of butter or evaporated milk on hand, it might be stirred in at the end, enriching the dish to something bordering on decadent. Children loved it naturally. They would poke through their bowls with eager spoons, hunting for plump raisins, saving the last few for a perfect bite. Parents loved it too, not just for the nourishment it offered, but for the moment of joy it brought to a table too often ruled by worry. A humble bowl of rice and raisins was, in many homes, a rare and precious pause from the grind of the day. Making rice and raisins today is like pressing a soft thumbprint into history. As you watch the rice puff up and the raisins darken into tiny gems, as you stir the pot and lift the lid to let the steam escape, you're stepping into the shoes of generations who understood that sweetness doesn't come from extravagance, but from intention and care. So go ahead. Fill a pot with rice and water, drop in a handful of raisins, and let time do the rest. Spoon it into a bowl, take that first warm bite, and taste the quiet resilience of a past that knew how to find joy even in the smallest of things. Number 10. Bean sandwiches. If ever there was a dish that captured the no-nonsense, practical spirit of Depression-era kitchens, it was the humble bean sandwich. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't fancy, but when you needed something to quiet a rumbling belly and stretch a dollar until it almost snapped, this was the answer waiting on the table. Imagine a lunch table in the 1930s. A wooden plank worn smooth by elbows, a dented tin lunch pail swung in from the mill or the fields. On the plate or tucked in wax paper, you'd find it. 2 slices of bread, often homemade or yesterday's loaf, spread with cold, mashed beans. Sometimes they were navy beans, cooked to softness with a bit of salt and bacon grease. Sometimes they were pintos, kidney beans, or black-eyed peas, whatever the cook had on hand, mashed until thick and hearty. The genius of the bean sandwich was its thrift and its quiet nourishment. Beans were cheap, packed with protein, and could be cooked in big batches, stretching over several meals. And bread, especially homemade, no-yeast depression bread, was a daily fixture, always at the ready to cradle whatever filling was available. Making one was as straightforward as you might guess. A pot of beans, cooked long and slow until tender, was mashed with a fork or the back of a spoon. If there was bacon grease, lard, or even a bit of butter in the house, it went in for flavor and richness. Some families added chopped onion or a sprinkle of pepper, others kept it plain and let the beans speak for themselves. Then it was simply spread between 2 slices of bread. No toasting, no garnish, no ceremony, just a solid, dependable meal in hand. For children, bean sandwiches often showed up in school lunches, packed alongside an apple or a cold boiled potato, maybe even wrapped in yesterday's newspaper if wax paper was a luxury. For working men, it was a standard in lunch pails, eaten in a few quick bites before heading back to the factory floor or the fields. And for mothers at home, it was an easy, filling option to tide everyone over until the next hot meal. There's an honest charm to the bean sandwich, a kind of culinary shrug that says, we'll make do and we'll make it work. And yet, beneath its plain surface, it offered what every Depression-era cook aimed to provide: nourishment, efficiency, and the reassurance that no one would leave the table hungry. Today, if you make yourself a bean sandwich, you might feel a flicker of that same thrift and pride. Maybe you'll season it up with herbs or garlic. Maybe you'll toast the bread or drizzle on a little olive oil. Or maybe, just maybe, You'll keep it plain, mash your beans with a little salt and fat, and take a bite that tastes like history itself. So open a can of beans or simmer a pot from scratch, mash them until they yield, and spread them thick between 2 slices of bread. With that simple act, you're honoring a generation that knew how to stretch, how to survive, and how to turn even the humblest of meals into an expression of care. Number 11, fried potatoes and onions. There's a kind of magic in a skillet of fried potatoes and onions. A magic that wafted through Depression-era kitchens, curling under doors and out open windows, calling children in from the yard and pulling tired workers toward the table. When money was tight and the pantry thin, a sack of potatoes and a couple of onions could still pull off something that tasted, if just for a moment, like abundance. Potatoes were the backbone of countless Depression meals, sturdy, affordable, and endlessly versatile. But pair them with onions and a bit of fat, and you had something more than just survival food. You had a dish that crackled with life in the pan, that filled the air with a smell so warm and savory it bordered on indulgent, and that brought a little excitement to an otherwise plain supper. The routine was as familiar as a favorite old song. First, the potatoes were peeled, or sometimes just scrubbed, skins left on to stretch the meal further. They were sliced thin or diced small, depending on the cook's preference, their pale flesh piled high in a bowl. The onions were peeled, their sharp scent filling the kitchen, then sliced into thin half-moons or rough chunks, ready to melt into sweetness in the hot pan. The skillet, usually cast iron and black from years of faithful service, was set on the stove to heat. In went the fat, maybe bacon grease saved in a jar, maybe lard, maybe just a thin slick of oil if that's all the house could spare. When it shimmered, the potatoes hit the pan with a hiss, quickly followed by the onions. The cook's spoon or spatula got to work, pushing and turning, letting the edges crisp, letting the onions brown and soften, coaxing out every bit of flavor the two could offer. The scent was irresistible, earthy, sweet, savory, smoky if bacon grease was involved, and before long, little feet would be shuffling into the kitchen, noses lifted in hope. The potatoes crackled and browned, the onions nearly disappeared into caramel threads, and the whole thing was finished with just a sprinkle of salt and pepper, maybe a pinch of paprika or garlic powder if the spice tin still had a whisper left inside. Served on chipped plates, alongside eggs or a wedge of bread, fried potatoes and onions turned an ordinary meal into a feast. They filled the belly, sure, but they also filled the heart, reminding families that even when times were hard, they could still share something satisfying and good. Today, when you make fried potatoes and onions, you're participating in a ritual that stretches back through generations. As you stand at the stove, spatula in hand, the sizzle in the pan becomes a kind of quiet conversation with the past. And when you sit down to eat, you'll taste more than just browned potatoes and soft onions. You'll taste the resilience, the thrift, and the love that turned a few humble ingredients into a meal worth remembering. So, pull out that skillet, slice up your potatoes and onions, and let the scent of the past fill your kitchen. You're about to make a dish that proves the simplest things are sometimes the most deeply satisfying. Number 12, bread pudding. If there's a dish that perfectly embodies the spirit of making do and making magic, it's bread pudding. Born from yesterday's scraps and today's small hopes, bread pudding was the sweet salvation of many Depression-era kitchens, a way to take stale crusts and leftover crumbs and turn them into something that felt, at least for one shining moment, like a little piece of luxury. In those hard years, not a crumb of bread was wasted. Families saved every heel, every slice gone dry, every biscuit that hardened in the tin. Collected in a kitchen bowl or tucked away in a cloth, these bits waited for their second act, and that act was often a homey, custard-soaked bread pudding. Picture a mother or grandmother in a dimly lit kitchen, her hands soft and sure as she tore day-old bread into rough chunks. Into a big bowl it went, joined by a mixture of milk, sometimes fresh, sometimes watered down, sometimes canned, sugar, and eggs if they were lucky to have them. A pinch of salt, a shake of cinnamon or nutmeg, maybe a splash of vanilla if the bottle still had a few drops rattling at the bottom. And if fortune smiled, a handful of raisins or nuts would be folded in, little jewels of sweetness hidden among the softening bread. The bread sat and soaked, drinking up the custard like thirsty ground after rain, while the oven preheated and the scent of sugar and spice began to drift through the kitchen. The pudding was poured into a battered baking dish, sometimes dotted with pats of butter, and slid into the oven, where it slowly transformed. As it baked, the edges crisped to a golden brown, the top puffed and set, and the custard worked its quiet magic, turning humble scraps into a warm, fragrant dessert. The smell was irresistible, the kind of aroma that called children in from chores, that made neighbors' noses lift across the fence, that turned an ordinary evening into something to look forward to. Served warm, maybe with a drizzle of cream or a spoonful of canned fruit, if such treasures were on hand. Bread pudding was more than just dessert. It was an act of care, a sweet reassurance that even in the leanest times, there was still room for comfort at the table. Today, making bread pudding is like lighting a small lantern to guide you back to those kitchens of old. As you stir the custard, tear the bread, and slide the dish into the oven, you're following the same rhythm that countless hands knew before you. And when you take that first soft, sweet bite, you're tasting more than cinnamon and sugar. You're tasting resilience, creativity, and the determination to find joy wherever it could be coaxed. So gather your leftover bread, warm some milk, crack a few eggs, and make yourself a dish that reminds us all, in every humble kitchen, there's the possibility of something extraordinary. Number 13, navy bean soup. If ever there was a pot of soup that earned its place in the story of survival, it's navy bean soup, a dish as old as America's earliest sailors, but one that truly came into its own during the Great Depression. In kitchens across the country, a simple pot of white beans simmering on the stove was more than just dinner. It was a promise that no one would go to bed hungry that night. Navy beans got their name, fittingly, from their long history as a staple in the U.S. Navy, prized for their long shelf life, high protein, and belly-filling heartiness. But during the lean years of the 1930s, you didn't have to be a sailor to appreciate their quiet magic. A pound of dried beans could feed a family for days, stretching into soups, stews, and spreads, with leftovers only getting better as the week wore on. The ritual of making navy bean soup began early, sometimes the night before. Dried beans were sorted by hand, spread out across a kitchen towel, with watchful fingers picking out pebbles and bad beans, then soaked overnight in a pot of cold water. Come morning, they were drained, rinsed, and set to simmer in a heavy pot with fresh water. The aromatics were few, but precious. A chopped onion, maybe a carrot or two, or a rib of celery if you were fortunate. And if the household was blessed with a ham bone, a chunk of salt pork, or even just a strip of bacon, it went into the pot like a prized treasure, perfuming the broth and coaxing every ounce of flavor from the humble ingredients. As the soup bubbled away over low heat, the house filled with a scent that felt like home itself, savory, earthy, faintly smoky, the promise of nourishment wafting through every room. Children would peek into the kitchen, noses lifted, counting the hours until supper. Mothers stirred the pot now and then, checking the beans for tenderness, tasting the broth, maybe adjusting with a pinch of salt or pepper, or, if luck allowed, a bay leaf or dash of vinegar for brightness. When it was finally time to eat, the soup was ladled into chipped bowls, sometimes thickened to a stew-like consistency, sometimes thin and brothy, always served with a slice of bread or a hunk of cornbread on the side. It was the kind of meal that drew out conversation at the table, that made people linger a little longer over their bowls, that wrapped up the day with warmth and quiet gratitude. Even now, navy bean soup carries the echo of those times. Making it today is like stirring up history. Soaking the beans, chopping the onion, waiting patiently as the pot works its slow, steady magic. And when you sit down to eat, you're reminded that good food isn't always about abundance. Sometimes it's about intention, care, and the simple act of feeding those you love. So set your beans to soak, light a low flame under the pot, and let the scent of navy bean soup remind you that with patience, thrift, and a little ingenuity, even the humblest ingredients can make a meal to remember. Number 14, mock chicken legs. When times were tough and meat was scarce, cooks didn't throw up their hands. They got clever, and few Depression-era dishes showcased that cleverness better than mock chicken legs, a recipe that dressed up scraps and stretched pennies, all while bringing smiles to the dinner table. At first glance, you might wonder, why go to the trouble of making something pretend to be chicken? But back in the 1930s, a proper Sunday roast or a platter of fried chicken was a rare luxury. Families craved not just the taste, but the feeling of sitting down to a real meal, and mock chicken legs delivered on that front, even if no chicken was involved. The genius of this dish was in its sleight of hand. Ground meats, often pork, sometimes veal or beef, or whatever trimmings the butcher could be talked into parting with, were seasoned generously with salt, pepper, and a pinch of herbs, or paprika if the spice tin allowed. The mixture was then molded around small wooden skewers or even trimmed sticks. giving them the familiar drumstick shape. A dunk in beaten egg, a roll through breadcrumbs or crushed crackers, and into the hot fat they went, sizzling away until golden and crisp. As they fried, the kitchen filled with an aroma that was, frankly, mouth-watering. Savory, rich, and faintly smoky, with a scent that could easily fool a hungry passerby into thinking a chicken dinner was underway. Children would dart in and out of the kitchen, craning their necks to see the skewers lined up in the pan, their mouths watering at the thought of that first crunchy bite. The first forkful was where the magic really happened. The crispy exterior gave way to tender, juicy meat. Not chicken, of course, but seasoned so well and fried so perfectly that it hardly mattered. Families didn't eat mock chicken legs and grumble over what they were missing. They ate them with delight, grateful for the ingenuity that turned modest means into memorable meals. On special occasions, a pan of gravy might be whisked up from the drippings, turning the meal into something truly celebratory. Served with mashed potatoes or cabbage, mock chicken legs became not just a dish, but a little act of triumph, a reminder that dignity and pleasure could survive even the hardest of times. Making them today is an exercise in playful nostalgia. As you shape the meat onto skewers, as you dip and roll and fry, you're not just preparing dinner, you're tapping into a long tradition of resilience and creativity. And when you sit down to eat, you'll likely find yourself smiling at the pure charm of it all, a dish that dared to pretend and ended up delivering something real. So pull out your ground meat, dust off the skewers, and heat up the skillet. Let the sizzle and scent transport you back to a time when making do wasn't just a necessity, but an art, and when a little imagination could turn a humble meal into a feast. Number 15, dandelion green salad. If there's a dish that captures the spirit of Depression-era resourcefulness, it's a simple bowl of dandelion green salad. At a time when grocery money was scarce and garden plots were often bare, families turned not just to the pantry, but to the yard, the fields, and even the cracks along the roadside for something green and edible. Dandelion greens weren't a last resort. They were a quiet triumph. Free for the picking, packed with vitamins, and surprisingly delicious. When handled with a little care, they became a beloved springtime staple on countless Depression-era tables. What was once written off as a weed became, in the hands of thrifty cooks, a badge of resilience and ingenuity. Picture a mother or child in the morning hours, crouched over the backyard, or wandering the edges of a dusty road, gathering bunches of dandelion leaves, young, tender ones, before the yellow blossoms burst open. Their fingers worked quickly, tugging at the base of each stem, careful to avoid the bitter, older leaves. Back in the kitchen, the greens were rinsed in cold water, the dirt and grit washed away until they glistened, a pile of fresh hope in the colander. The preparation was humble but thoughtful. Some families simply dressed the greens with a sprinkle of salt, a splash of vinegar, and maybe a pinch of sugar if they wanted to soften the sharpness. Others turned to the treasured jar of bacon grease or drippings saved from a rare side of pork, warming it in a skillet and pouring the hot fat over the greens, wilting them slightly and infusing the dish with smoky depth. It was a sensory moment, the hiss of hot grease hitting cold leaves, the sharp smell of vinegar mixing with the earthy greens, the glistening sheen that told everyone dinner was nearly ready. For many, this salad wasn't just a side dish, it was a rite of spring. After a long, gray winter of root vegetables and canned goods, dandelion greens were a fresh, peppery reminder that the earth was still generous, that renewal was always just around the corner. Children often learned early to appreciate their slight bitterness, especially when tempered with a touch of sweetness or the irresistible richness of pork fat. At the table, the salad was served alongside potatoes, beans, or a simple piece of bread. It was eaten slowly, thoughtfully, with the kind of quiet appreciation that comes from knowing you coaxed something delicious out of nothing but patience and know-how. Today, preparing dandelion green salad is like joining a chorus of past generations who understood that good food doesn't always come from the market or the butcher. It's an invitation to step outside, to pay attention, to remember that even in tough times, nature offers its gifts freely, if we're willing to bend down and gather them. So the next time you spot those familiar jagged leaves poking up from the lawn, don't just see weeds, see possibility. Pick a handful, rinse them well, and toss together a salad that tastes like spring, survival, and the quiet joy of making something out of what the world gives you. Number 16. Lard sandwiches. Of all the dishes that came out of the Great Depression, none perhaps says more about grit, humility, and survival than the lard sandwich. Just the name can raise modern eyebrows, but in the 1930s, it was a simple, honest way to fill an empty belly. a reminder that even the most unassuming ingredients could carry a family through hard times. Lard was the fat of the people. Rendered from pork, it was cheap, easy to store, and endlessly versatile. It greased skillets, crisped up biscuits, flavored beans, and yes, spread across slices of bread when there was nothing else to be had. It wasn't seen as indulgence or poverty. It was simply what was available, and it played its part proudly on the kitchen table. Imagine the scene: a mother or father reaching for the bread box, pulling out a loaf of homemade soda bread or yesterday's store loaf, perhaps a little dry around the edges. From the tin on the counter, they'd scoop a small spoonful of lard, soft, white, and clean, and spread it thinly across each slice. Some added a sprinkle of salt for a savory bite, others reached for a pinch of sugar to mimic a sweet treat. And just like that, lunch was served. For many children, the lard sandwich was their midday meal, packed into a tin or wrapped in waxed paper, eaten on a break at school or in the fields. It was portable, sturdy, and calorie-dense, enough to give them the energy to carry on with the long days of chores or study. Adults, too, leaned on the humble sandwich, especially when the job site or the rail yards offered little more than hard labor and short pay. The beauty of the lard sandwich wasn't in its flavor, though there was a quiet satisfaction in the way the fat melted into the bread, softening it just so, adding a mild, savory richness. Its real beauty was in what it represented: an ability to endure, to make something, anything, out of what little remained. It was the edible embodiment of perseverance. For some families, the lard sandwich even became a small canvas for creativity. A bit of mustard or chopped onion turned it into a punchy snack. A thin slice of tomato from the garden elevated it into something almost elegant. And on rare occasions, when a bit of leftover bacon or cured meat was around, it found its way between those slices, making the humble sandwich a true feast. Making a lard sandwich today might feel like an act of historical curiosity, but it's also a quiet tribute. As you spread that fat across a piece of good, crusty bread, you're reaching back in time, touching hands with those who knew what it was to go without, and yet still found a way to break bread together. So, the next time you're tempted to toss that old loaf or overlook the tub of lard in the fridge, pause for a moment, toast a slice, spread it thin, sprinkle a pinch of salt, and take a bite of the past. A reminder that even the simplest meals can carry deep stories of resilience, dignity, and survival. Number 17, macaroni and tomatoes. Few Depression-era dishes are as unassuming or as quietly beloved as macaroni and tomatoes. It's a dish that doesn't make a fuss, doesn't try to show off, but when set down on the table, draws grateful smiles and eager forks all the same. In the 1930s, macaroni was a pantry workhorse, cheap, shelf-stable, and ready to stretch into meals when meat was scarce and vegetables were hard to come by. And tomatoes, especially canned ones, were prized for their bright, tangy flavor, able to lift the plainest of starches into something that tasted, well, like dinner. Together, they became a humble classic, feeding countless families and offering a little spark of comfort on even the hardest days. Picture a small kitchen, its shelves lined with jars of home-canned tomatoes, their ruby glow catching the afternoon sun. A pot of water bubbles on the stove, waiting for a fistful of macaroni, sometimes elbows, sometimes broken spaghetti, sometimes whatever pasta was on sale or available at the local dry goods store. As the noodles boil, a second pot simmers beside it, filled with stewed or canned tomatoes, maybe mashed slightly with a fork to break them down, their juices thickening with a little butter or lard if the household was lucky. Some families flavored their tomato sauce with a pinch of sugar to soften the acidity, others added black pepper, garlic, or a scrap of onion for extra depth. And when meat scraps or a little bacon grease were on hand, they were stirred in reverently, turning the dish from humble to downright hearty. But even in its simplest form, just pasta and tomatoes, this meal offered a kind of satisfaction that stuck to the ribs and lingered in memory. Once the pasta was tender, it was drained and tumbled into the pot of tomatoes, stirred together until every noodle gleamed red and glossy. The sound of the spoon scraping the pot, the steam rising in little clouds, the first ladleful hitting a waiting plate. These were the small, familiar rituals that turned a kitchen into a haven and a meal into a memory. Children would twirl the noodles on their forks, slurp up the tangy sauce, and go back for seconds if the pot allowed. Adults would eat more slowly, savoring the way the tart tomatoes played against the soft pasta, maybe topping it with a shake of salt or a dusting of black pepper. It wasn't a fancy meal, but it was a good one, the kind of dish that made you grateful for a warm plate and a full belly. Today, macaroni and tomatoes still carry that humble magic. When you cook it, you're joining a long line of home cooks who knew how to transform a few basic ingredients into something deeply comforting. As you stir the pasta into the sauce, taste for seasoning, and fill your bowl, you're touching a piece of history, one that reminds us that good food doesn't have to be complicated or expensive to be meaningful. So boil that pasta, open those tomatoes, and let the aroma of this simple, satisfying dish fill your kitchen. You'll be honoring a past generation and maybe rediscovering the quiet joy of cooking with what you have. Number 18, Mulligan Stew. If there's a dish that truly belongs to the people, it's Mulligan Stew, a meal born not just from poverty, but from community. In the rough and tumble camps of the Great Depression, especially in the hobo jungles that sprouted on the edges of rail yards and city dumps, Mulligan Stew wasn't just food, it was a survival ritual, a symbol of resourcefulness and shared resilience. Mulligan Stew didn't follow a written recipe. It followed need, generosity, and whatever ingredients could be scrounged, bartered, or begged. Picture a ragtag gathering under a railroad bridge or in a wooded clearing, smoke curling from a battered tin can perched over a fire. Into that pot went the collective contributions of the group. Maybe a carrot or two, a shriveled potato, half an onion, a can of beans, or a fistful of rice. If someone was lucky enough to have a scrap of meat, it became the treasure of the stew, broken into pieces so small they flavored every ladleful. The beauty of Mulligan Stew was its adaptability. It welcomed everything, a handful of wilted greens, a splash of ketchup, even the heel of a stale loaf, or a sprinkle of salt, swiped from a diner counter. Nothing was wasted, and no contribution was too small. The stew pot became a symbol of shared fate, of strangers banding together to create something warming, filling, and strangely comforting from almost nothing. Making it meant building a fire, setting a pot or can over the flames, and adding ingredients one by one, stirring slowly as the broth thickened and the flavors melded. The scent, smoky, earthy, savory, drifted through the camp, drawing the hungry closer, bowls and tin cups in hand. There was an unspoken understanding that everyone got a share, no matter how little they'd added, and that the stew wasn't finished until every possible scrap had been simmered down into something edible. For many, the taste of Mulligan Stew was as much about memory as flavor. It was the taste of lean years, yes, but also of solidarity, of the warmth that comes not just from a full belly, but from the kindness of others. Around those campfires, stories were swapped, songs were sung, and for a little while, the crushing loneliness of the road or the jobless day was softened by the simple act of breaking bread together. Today, making Mulligan Stew is an invitation to reflect on that history. As you chop your vegetables, stir your pot, and taste for seasoning, you can almost hear the echoes of laughter and conversation from those long ago camps. You're reminded that food isn't just about sustenance, it's about connection, about the way we care for one another when times are hard. So gather what you have, a few carrots, some potatoes, a little broth or water, and make yourself a pot of Mulligan Stew. Let it bubble on the stove. Let the scent fill your home. And when you sit down to eat, remember the countless hands and hearts that once gathered around a pot just like it, finding warmth, dignity, and a bit of joy in the hardest of times. Number 19, Johnny Cakes. Before there were Depression kitchens, before there were pioneer wagons rolling west, there were Johnny Cakes, a humble cornmeal griddle cake that carried generations of Americans through lean times. By the 1930s, Johnny Cakes were already an old friend at the table, a trusty standby when wheat flour ran out, when bread was gone, or when you simply needed something warm and filling to stretch the family meal just a little further. Johnny Cakes have deep roots, reaching back to Native American cooks who ground corn into meal and mixed it with water to form patties that were baked on hot stones or griddles. As settlers adopted the practice, the recipe evolved and traveled, gaining names like Journey Cakes, Ash Cakes, and Hoe Cakes, depending on the region and the folks making them. But by the time of the Great Depression, Johnny Cake had become the catch-all name for this crisp-edged, golden comfort food. In those hard years, the ingredients were simplicity itself: cornmeal, a pinch of salt, a splash of water or milk, maybe a little sugar if you wanted a touch of sweetness. If you were lucky, an egg or a spoonful of bacon grease found its way into the batter, adding richness and helping the cakes crisp up beautifully in the pan. Families would stir the ingredients together in a big bowl, the cornmeal slipping through their fingers like sand before the liquid turned it into a thick, spoonable batter. The cooking was its own small ceremony. A hot skillet, often cast iron, was set over the fire or stovetop, greased lightly with lard, butter, or fat, saved from the morning's bacon. Into the pan went generous spoonfuls of batter, sizzling as they hit the heat. The cakes were patted gently with the back of a spoon, left to firm up on one side before being flipped with care to reveal their crisp, golden undersides. As the Johnny cakes cooked, the air filled with a warm, toasty aroma, the scent of cornmeal taking on new life, the faint whisper of bacon or butter. Children would hover close, watching as the cakes puffed and crisped, waiting eagerly for the first batch to hit the plate. Served stacked high, with a drizzle of syrup if fortune allowed, or simply with a pat of butter or swipe of lard, Johnny cakes were more than just a side dish. They were the main event. Eaten alongside beans, soups, or stews, or even as a standalone meal, they offered both nourishment and the small, familiar joy of something hot and homemade. Today, making Johnny cakes is like flipping through the pages of American history. As you stir the cornmeal, heat the skillet, and watch the batter transform into crisp-edged cakes, you join a long line of cooks who understood the power of simplicity. And when you sit down to eat, you're not just tasting cornmeal and salt, you're tasting resilience, tradition, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from making something wonderful out of the most ordinary things. So pull out your cornmeal, warm up your skillet, and make yourself a stack of Johnny cakes. Let each bite remind you of the generations before who found comfort and strength in a dish as old as this country itself. Number 20, oatmeal with water, no milk oatmeal. Of all the Depression-era dishes, perhaps none was as plain, as modest, or as quietly powerful as a bowl of oatmeal made with water. No milk, no cream, sometimes not even sugar, just oats, water, and a pinch of salt, stirred slowly over a low flame until they thickened into something soft, warm, and life-sustaining. In today's world, where oatmeal comes in a dozen flavors and fancy cafe bowls are piled high with fruits, nuts, and honey, it's easy to overlook the stark beauty of this simplest version. But during the Great Depression, that humble pot of oats was a lifeline, a meal that filled empty stomachs, stretched the grocery budget, and provided steady comfort when there was little else to offer. The process was a quiet ritual. A scoop of oats, often steel-cut or rolled, bought in bulk from the general store, was measured into a pot of simmering water. A pinch of salt was added, maybe a faint dusting of sugar if the family could spare it. Slowly, carefully, the oats were stirred, their raw edges softening as the mixture thickened, filling the kitchen with a mild, nutty aroma. For many families, especially those with several mouths to feed, this watery oatmeal wasn't just a breakfast. It was often breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was spooned into chipped bowls, eaten slowly, sometimes stretched with an extra splash of water to serve just one more person. There was no shame in it, only the quiet acknowledgement that you were doing the best you could with what you had. Children learned to savor the small pleasures hidden in this modest meal. The way the oats plumped and softened, the way a tiny sprinkle of sugar or a pat of butter, if you were lucky, could transform a spoonful into something special. Sometimes a bit of syrup or molasses showed up at the table, but often it was just the oats, plain, earnest, and somehow still satisfying. For parents, a pot of oatmeal was a source of both comfort and heartache. It meant their children wouldn't go hungry that day, but it also reminded them of the thin line they walked between making do and going without. And yet, there was pride, too, in stretching the pantry, in keeping the family fed, in offering a meal that, though humble, was warm and nourishing. Making oatmeal with water today may feel almost ceremonial. As you stir the pot, listen to the soft bubbling, and watch the grains swell and break down, you're touching a thread that runs through decades of kitchen tables and across countless households. It's a reminder that food is not always about indulgence. Sometimes it's simply about care, persistence, and survival. So the next time you make a pot of oats, try it the old way. Skip the milk, hold back the sugar, and taste the quiet resilience in every bite. You may find, as so many did before, that even the simplest meals can carry deep meaning, and that sometimes a bowl of oats is more than enough. As we wrap up our journey through 20 cheap recipes that helped families survive the Great Depression, let's take a step back and truly appreciate the ingenuity, resilience, and love that went into every meal. These dishes were born out of necessity, but they became something far more meaningful. They were symbols of survival, of communities coming together, and of parents doing whatever it took to keep their families fed, even when the world seemed stacked against them. These recipes weren't made for the sake of convenience, luxury, or taste alone. They were born out of creativity, turning whatever ingredients were available into something nourishing, something that offered warmth and comfort in a time of uncertainty. Whether it was the humble beans stretched across multiple meals, the simple magic of cornmeal and water turned into Johnny cakes, or the cleverness of mock apple pie using nothing more than crackers and spices, these meals were about making the most of what you had. They were meals with heart, the kind of meals that kept spirits high even when hope was in short supply. But beyond the food itself, these recipes tell the stories of families who, despite losing so much, never lost their will to nourish. They remind us that no matter how lean things get, there's always a way to make something out of almost nothing. The people who lived through the Great Depression found resourcefulness in their kitchens, and that same resourcefulness can inspire us today. In a world where we often have too much and waste far too much, perhaps it's time to look back at these humble meals and remember that there's power in simplicity, power in gratitude, and power in making do with what we have. So, as you try these recipes at home, don't just think of them as meals from the past. Think of them as acts of resilience, of community, and of love. Love for the people you're feeding, and love for the tradition of making something special, no matter the odds. And while we may not be in the midst of a depression today, there's something deeply relevant about these recipes in our fast-paced, wasteful world. They remind us that the best meals don't come from expensive ingredients or time-consuming processes. They come from a little creativity, a lot of heart, and a belief that food has the power to bring people together. Thank you for joining me on this journey through history. Remember, the greatest meals are often the simplest ones.